Good morning, my friends. Welcome back to our study in the fourth gospel, or as it's commonly known, the Gospel of John. We are beginning to enter chapter 6, and in the previous lesson, I laid out a number of kind of important things, and now I want to kind of bring those into focus here for this particular talk. One of the things I noted in the last session is that there are 7 semea, signs, in the fourth gospel, widely acknowledged by the critics. And hey, welcome everybody. Good to see everybody here. Hi Alan. Hi Luther, Howard, Michael, Sarah, Jeff. Cool. Luke, got a whole crowd. Oh my, here you all come. Wonderful. Alrighty, so I'll just say hello to everybody and carry on here if you don't mind. Good. Okay, so if you have a Bible, you really want to bring a Bible to these studies, because I'm going to be working text. I'm going to be bouncing back and forth in this session between Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, because I want to talk about the center of Jesus' ministry. But I first want to do it in terms of the fourth gospel structure, and then show you the same can be found in the synoptic narratives as well. It's a fascinating study to do this. So you have 7 signs. Begins with the miracle at Cana. Number 2, healing of the nobleman's son. Number 3, the healing of the man that's lame at the pool, can't get in the pool. Semea number 4 is going to be turning the feeding of the 5,000. I started to say turning the bread into the body. I mean, I'm already into the narrative, but feeding of the 5,000 is the 5th one. The 6th one is the healing of the man born blind, and that parallels. And remember, it's a chiastic structure, so it's going A, B, C, D, C prime, B prime, A prime, and the A's connect, the B's connect, the C's connect, and the D. That's the center of the chiasmus. It's the center of the narrative. It's the point. It's the focal point. We've been leading up to this, and we're going to go away from it. So again. 1, 2, 3, 4. So you have the healing of the man born blind in chapter 9, paralleling the healing of the man at the pool in chapter 5. You have the raising of Lazarus and the healing of the nobleman's son. It's very similar to a resurrection story in the sense this kid is dying. You see, there's a parallel. And then finally, the wedding at Cana. Now, there's no other signs after the raising of Lazarus. But as a number of scholars have observed, the crucifixion functions as the 7th sign, and it mirrors the wedding at Cana. Okay, so you have this central section in and around something that occurs with the feeding of the 5,000, and I've noted again previously that the Johannine writer, who I actually think has good credibility as a historical witness. That doesn't mean that everything that's in the Gospel of John came from Jesus' mouth, because it doesn't. We have seen that. This writer can weave his voice, Jesus' voice, John the Baptist's voice all together, and you don't know where one starts and the other begins. You'll see something in this narrative that's very similar. This whole Eucharistic discourse you're going to get here in chapter 6 has got to be one of the most mind-blowing things you'll ever come across. And I hope by the time we're getting into that, you're following us, your mind is just as blown. Okay? That's what the writer's leading you to, man. This is like theology on LSD. He's just taking you on a trip. One that will turn you inside out, upside down, take you from darkness to light. He's just doing everything he can to help you see a perspective, a way of seeing things. Now remember, as I pointed out in that chiastic structure, water to wine, already symbolic reference to blood, particularly because of the Jesus-Moses parallelism in the fourth gospel. Remember from the prologue, we already had that hinted. Torah came through Moses, grace and truth through Jesus. Excuse me. And we're going to see this repetition here, especially in this next sign, and the direct allusion to the manna in the wilderness. And of course, we have the light of the world in John 8, which we'll see is a reference back to the Shekinah glory, and so on and so forth. So you have the Jesus-Moses parallelism influencing this. These signs. You have blood, water to wine. You have blood in this Eucharistic narrative that's coming here. You have to munch on my flesh and drink my blood. And you've got blood on the cross. Blood suffuses this narrative, as I've pointed out. It's one of the three witnesses for the Johannine writer. Water, blood, spirit. We've already seen the water theme in this gospel. You with me so far? So the writer is now pushing us to the center of Jesus' life. Now, here's what is absolutely fascinating about this whole thing. When you look at the synoptic narratives, and I'm uncertain as to whether the writer of the fourth gospel had access to any of the synoptic writers' gospel texts. I'm uncertain on this still. I know the theories out there. It's possible, as Barrett noted, and I can't wait for John Painter's revision of that commentary to come out. But it's possible, as Barrett noted in his commentary, that the writer has Mark. I don't know. You get to the Passion narrative, and there are these all of a sudden remarkable similarities with Luke in the Passion narrative. There doesn't appear to be any awareness of Matthew's gospel or use or critique of it here. So it would be limited to either Markan or Lucan tradition. But I'm totally uncertain about any of that. I've made up my mind after 42 years. I don't think I need to. That being said, when you look at this central section of Jesus' life, from this fourth gospel perspective, where the crowd is going to make him a king, and everything goes to pieces after this, you find the exact same phenomenon in the synoptic gospels, and you have the two exact phenomenon that are part and parcel of this three-part connected reality. The first, obviously, being the feeding of the 5,000, the second having to do with kingship, and the third with halakha. Now, let me show you where I'm going with this. You'll recall that chapter 5 has to do with an issue related to Torah interpretation, or halakha. How do we live? How do we do halakha? How do we do Torah? How do we do it today? This is the good Jewish question that would be asked in Jesus' day. If you want to do God's will is Torah. How do you do this Torah thing? And of course, there's so much in Torah. It's unbelievable what the rabbis can distill from Torah. Just astonishing work, very creative work done by the rabbis, and with just Torah. And the interpretation now of the text. Who has the right to determine what is lawful and not lawful on the Sabbath? And what happens when somebody comes along and says, there's no Sabbath for God? God hasn't taken a Sabbath. Why are you guys doing it? And you now have issues of authority tied in with issues of who has the right to interpret Torah, don't you? Same issues we will see down the road when we do some of Paul's letters like this, or we'll exegete Paul's letters by video, whether through subscription service or free because I've got enough supporters. We'll see. But we'll do that. We'll see the same phenomenon there. We're coming down to the question of interpretation of Torah. How do you interpret? Okay? So that's the first thing. Now, second thing is, here in the Johannine narrative, verse 14, feeds the 5,000. They want to make him king. As I pointed out in the previous lesson, they got political with Jesus. They wanted him to come, and they wanted to take him by force. You have to understand this. They're taking him by force. What does that mean? That means they are crowning him king, and this army's on the march. In a land where there's already a king. In a country that's already ruled by a Caesar. This is nothing but trouble. And so we have the kingship issue, we have the feeding of the 5,000, and we have the halakha issue. Now, what's very important here is that there's going to be a fourth phenomenon. And that's has to do with bread. Okay, in John 6, of course, it's the whole bread, manna, bread of life, bada, bada, bada. But let's look at the synoptics. Okay, so let's first turn. I have all these Bibles open here. Let's first turn to the Gospel of Mark. Now, remember, as I suggested yesterday, and if I was correct in this, if Jay should ever watch one of these, he can make a comment on. But I thought his dissertation was in and around the doublets here to be found in Mark 6, 7, and 8, where you have the feeding of the 5,000 in Mark 6, and then you have this center section, chapter 7, that's a whole debate about halakha. And the Pharisees gathered with some scribes. They saw some of his disciples ate with hands defiled, that is unwashed. You have, Jesus going down saying, you have a fine way of rejecting the commandments of God in order to keep your tradition. It's not what goes into a man, but what comes out. I mean, it's all halakha. It's all a discussion about interpretation of Torah. Right here. Who has the authority to interpret Torah? As we saw in the Hardin narrative in chapter 5, previous to the feeding of the 5,000, as we're seeing here in Mark's structure, immediately following, same phenomenon, different sequence, but same phenomenon, chapter 7. Then you get to, there's another little couple miracle stories, typical of Mark, and then you get to chapter 8, now you get the feeding of the 4,000. But it's a doublet, it's the same story, okay? And again, in the Mark narrative, the Pharisees go, give us a sign. Oh, man, for crying out loud. The guy just feeds 4,000 people. He's going to give us a sign. And it says, no sign will be given to this generation. No Samaya will be given to this generation. That's Jesus. No sign. Why? Because you can give them signs up the yin-yang. And they're going to figure out a way to dismiss them or explain them away. It's human nature. It's what we do when we're religious. Anyway, look at this. Now they had forgotten to bring bread. And they only had one loaf. But wait a minute. Just the previous narrative, you got baskets full of bread, right? And here's the kid in the boat is one loaf of bread. It's like, oh no, I just think it's humorous. I just really do. I don't know if anybody reading the gospel text reads that but I think it's humorous. And it says that Jesus cautioned them, take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of Herod. And they discussed it with one another, saying, we got no bread, because he's talking about the leaven of Herod, boom, boom, boom. And then he talks about the bread that came from the feeding of the 5,000. Again, halakha, feeding of the 5,000. We're going to see in a moment kingship issues in Mark, as we have in John, but so far we have 3. Now you come immediately after this discourse. Jesus takes his disciples to the village of Caesarea Philippi, to the territory, village in that area, the Gentile territory. Gets them out of Jewish territory, gets them out of Herod's jurisdiction. Because all Herod has to do is get word that Jesus of Nazareth has an army of 5,000 men. And Jesus is in deep doo-doo. So he gets out of Herod's jurisdiction entirely. And then we have the whole narrative about the question of, who do people say I am? Okay? You will find I'm not going to be able to find it quickly. I'm sorry. So you have this retreat to Caesarea Philippi and the rejection of the Davidic Messiah concept by Jesus, and the introduction for the first time of the suffering huios tu anthropou, the suffering Son of Man, the suffering Bar Nashah, the suffering true human, the human being who suffers. That is now the key figure by which to interpret everything. Jesus says, this is who I'm going to be. This is how you want to understand me, you got to understand who I am as the suffering human being. You got to get this. That's Jesus at this point. When Peter says, man, you went to the wrong rabbi school, Jesus has to go get behind me, Satan. And because what's the issue here? The issue's the same as the crowd. In John 6, the crowd gets it right. This is the prophet to come. They get that right. And then they want to make him king. That's the wrong part. Same thing with Peter. And when you get to the Gospel of Matthew, it's Matthew who does this elaboration, so you get this double nuance. Peter's confession is, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Now, Matthew, of course, wants both appellates to be true, and he will do his own little thing there with Peter. And the rebuke of Peter's much less of a sting, really. I don't, as I recall. Now I'm curious because I don't recall off the top of my head how Matthew handles the rebuke, and I'm not going to be able to find that quickly, so I'm going to ignore that. In Matthew's Gospel, we find the same kind of structure. The center of Matthew's Gospel, or at least one of the centers proposed by the scholars, is the center of the 3 of the 5 discourses, which is the chapter on parables in chapter 13. The 5 discourses being the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5 through 7, the missionary discourse, chapter 10, the parables, chapter 13, the ecclesiological discourse of chapter 18, and the eschatological discourse of chapters 24 and 25. Chapter 13 being the center discourse. There is, now this is an odd thing, but even the dispensationalists, when they read Matthew, for them chapter 13 is the shift chapter. So it's interesting that they get that little piece right with regard to Matthew's structure. But there is a shift in this Matthew's text from reception to rejection, and all these parables deal with that reception or rejection of this message of the reign of God. And then after that chapter, you get the beheading of John the Baptist. Now this is. I'm trying to think of, there's technical language for this, and my brain is fried. And so I can't think of the correct term for it. It's, I think if I'm thinking correctly, it's proleptic. It's kind of like this hinting at where the narrative's going. It's going right into sacred violence. It's going right into death. It's going right into blood. You have the death of John the Baptist, and then it's, the feeding of the 5,000. I think it's fascinating. Again, we don't have any mention here of kingship, but we do have the insertion of the Herod John the Baptist narrative, which can only from a Jewish Christian perspective be an anti-Herodian narrative, you see. So you certainly do have this kingship motif, Herod's, inserted here, whether or not that's to be correspondent with the business of them wanting to make Jesus king, as we find in John's gospel, or whatever it was the crowds wanted to do with Jesus. And he knows that they're completely misunderstanding him. I think he knows he has to make him king. I think that's implicit, because he does retreat to Caesarea Philippi in Gentile territory. At any rate, but following the feeding of the 5,000, you've got next in Matthew 15, Mark 7. That is the whole halakhic discussion again. So and you can see a similar kind of thing in Luke. The point is, Jesus' ministry in all 4 Gospels has 2 sides that are going to lead to his demise. The first has to do with the signs he does. Everybody wants a deus ex machina. I do. I really do. I want a God that just comes and works miracles, man. Just makes them happen. And we all know that God doesn't exist. It exists in the imaginations of certain Christians, who think that God intervenes on their side because they're holy and righteous and just and true. All that wonderful stuff and open. Anyway, back to the text. I'm getting snarky lately, aren't I? I don't apologize. I think American Christianity is just in the crapper. Needs to be flushed. Really does. Needs. It's all sacrificial. The whole thing is sacrificial in one way or another. American Protestant Christianity, the whole thing. If you look at it carefully enough, you'll see this. It doesn't matter if you're liberal, conservative, evangelical, fundamentalist, progressive, or whatever. The economies of exchange just reek from American Protestant theologies today. All of them, frankly. I mean, I can pretty much sniff this stuff out reading a book. You can see, people will deny they have economies of exchange. They're all into grace. They're all into love. They're all into peace. But boom, it's there. It slips in somewhere. It always slips in somewhere. And that's the bane here of the gospel. And for those of you that think Luther got it right or Calvin got it right, I'm going to tell you both of them got the wrong relation of law to gospel. Both of them, and the Anabaptists too. Frankly, the Catholics and the Orthodox as well. Modern Christianity, folks, is sacrificial. It's not the faith Jesus came to teach. Thankfully, there are those, and it's happening because the Spirit's at work in the world. There are millions of people who see. And the internet has been able to bring us all together, form little human communities online, and be able to know that, we're not alone. We are like, in some sense, early Anabaptists or a Francis of Assisi. We're stepping out on our own, and that's good. That's good. That's healthy for the church. So, at any rate, you come back to this feeding, and there's a couple of things I want to note here again, and before we tackle the narrative. First, in the synoptic perspective, one of the things about the feeding of the 5,000, and I don't know if you've paid attention to this or you've noticed this before, but and so let's use, for example, I'll use the Markan narrative since it's the one that Matthew and Luke would have riffed off of. And I just got to find chapter 6. I'm using a New English Bible. That's got to be chapter 6, right? Yes, here you go. Okay. I want you to listen to the language that's used with regard to the feeding of the 5,000. He had the people sit down in groups on the green grass. They sat in rows, 100 rows of 50 each. That's military formation. Man, if Herod's got spies out there and they're looking down and they're going, look at this, man, rank upon rank, 5,000, holy cow. 100 rows, 50 men each. Boom. Taking the 2 loaves and the 2 fishes, he looked up to heaven, said the blessing, broke the bread, gave the disciples, took, blessed, broke, gave. Those are the 4 verbs of the Eucharistic ritual. Took the bread, blessed the bread, broke the bread, gave the bread. And you'll remember that from the Passover meal. You may also remember it from the Emmaus story. Sit down to eat. Jesus took the loaf, blessed it, broke it, gave it. And that's when they recognized him, right there in that action. That's when they recognized him, and he's gone, and they're just going, oh man, Jesus just gave us Bible study. We didn't know it. I don't know, again, whether the tradition has influenced the narrative, or in fact, whether this is there was a peculiar way that Jesus had his meal blessing that somehow people recognized, took, blessed, broke, and gave. It doesn't matter to me. The point is, from a synoptic perspective, this feeding of the 5,000 is a Eucharistic event. I mention that because in the Johannine narrative, what you're going to have, interestingly enough, is this. Jesus took the loaves and Eucharisted. Eucharisto. He gave thanks. He took the loaf and gave thanks, and then distributed it. But it's he took. There's your verb, lambano, and eulogisen. He blessed. I'm sorry, Eucharistin. He Eucharistin. He Eucharisted, and that's already a major key that what you're going to get in chapter 6 is a Eucharistic sermon. In fact, the only Eucharistic sermon we have from the apostolic period, the only sustained understanding of the Eucharist we have from the early church, right here in chapter 6. And already it's a signal in this narrative, you see. So whether synoptic or Johannine, both of them have deep Eucharistic overtones in this narrative, in this feeding of the 5,000. And of course, the Eucharist is about Jesus' death, isn't it? Absolutely it is. Okay, so we've gone over that. I felt like when I was getting through chapter 5, I skipped over phaulos, what it means to quote, do petty things. The person who does petty things will be condemned. But I was going to do some more work with you there, but I think I'll leave that for now. And I would ask you to tie this concept of phaulos that we found in chapter 5, verse 28. In the translation of the NIV, those who have done evil. I told you evil. It's not poneros. It's phaulos. It's this mean-spiritedness. Those the people who do things mean-spiritedly. These kind of people, you know. No comment. Okay. They're the ones that will rise to judgment rather than to life. At any rate. Okay, so you have this narrative now. Jesus, and it's different in the Johannine version. You might want to compare the Johannine and the Synoptic version. In the Synoptic version, it's they're just telling them that they have nothing to eat. Jesus then proceeds to organize them and feed them. The Johannine narrative does it a little differently, as typical of this author's style. When Jesus looked up and saw I'm sorry, let me just back up here. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee. That is, the Sea of Tiberias. That should give you a clue right there. You are not dealing with John the son of Zebedee, because there is no way a hometown boy is going to call the Sea of Galilee his Sea of Galilee by some other name, like a Roman name like Tiberias. No way. No way. Absolutely not. That's one of Pearson Parker's, one of his many markers that there's no way Zebedee would have written that. Sometime after this, who could have written it? A non-revolutionary, non-Galilean, didn't care. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, and a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the miraculous signs, the semeia he had performed on the sick. So that's why they're following. They've after this whole Sabbath controversy, man, there's just crowds following him out there. And it says, then Jesus went up on the hillside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover feast was near. In just let me get to the text. In Luke 13, verse 11. Is that it? Luke 13:11. Am I looking at the right thing? No, I'm not looking at the right thing. Can't read my own notes here. My bad. Skip that. Apparently in Luke, Jesus skips a Passover. He's hanging here up on a mountain. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, I guess to Philip, oh, where should we buy bread for these people to eat? He asked this only to test him. You gotta love this. You gotta love this, the Johannine writer. He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. It's just hilarious. Now here's Jesus saying, where shall we buy bread? Now here's Philip. He's been traveling with Jesus, right? He may have gone to Canaan. He's seen the nobleman's son. He's seen the man at the pool of Bethesda. And I mean, he's seen Jesus do these all kinds of other signs. He's just following him everywhere. Jesus says, where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? What should Philip have said at that point? Right, Jesus, man, you're the bread of life. Philip says, Lord, you don't understand. It would take 8 months' wages. 8 months' wages. For us to buy enough bread for each person to have a bite. 8 months' wages. Remember the nard that Mary pours on Jesus' feet. Judas just cost a year's wages. Again, little details that are fascinating, that make one wonder about questions of historical veracity. 8 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. Another one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. Kind of like, Pippin in The Lord of the Rings. What about second breakfasts? Okay. Andrew spoke up. Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. How far will they go among so many? You gotta love his emphasis. He's got these bags. Here's a boy. This kid's got little small barley loaves, Jesus, and a couple of little small fish. He should have been catch and release, but he kept them because he's hungry. Jesus has the people sit down. There was plenty of grass in that place, not like some of you were thinking. And the men sat down, about 5,000 of them. There's your army. And if you don't think there's an army concept here, they gathered just remember the synoptic narratives of the groupings. Jesus took the loaf, Eucharisted, distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. It is interesting when you look at the 2nd century in the early church. There are different Eucharistic items. There's some that have salt, some have water, bread, wine. Some don't have wine. There are different things that are used, and then eventually it will obviously bread, wine. Okay. When they had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." That's why I think it's funny. He's telling them, gather it up, don't waste anything. Where it went, we don't know, but when they get ready to go walk on water, they only got 1 loaf. And then we have this kind of reality, this realization set in. After the people saw the semia, the sign Jesus did, they began to say, surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world. That's where they're right. Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king, that's where they were wrong. By force, withdrew again into the hills by himself. Now, in each of these narratives, immediately following the feeding of the 5,000, in the synoptic tradition and the Johannine tradition, comes a walking on the water. Jesus walks on the water, across the lake. Okay? Now, you can come to a narrative like this 1 of 2 ways. 3 ways. 1 of 3 ways. The first way is, it's in the Bible. God said it. I believe it. That sells it. It says Jesus walked on water. He walked on water. That's it. It's God's word. You can do that, in which case you're just going to end up just knowing absolutely nothing about the text. Second way you can come to this text is go, oh man, you kidding, man, ever since the Enlightenment and Rene Descartes and Immanuel Kant and now modern philosophy and modern science and all the things we know things like this don't happen. Nobody can walk on water. It's physically impossible to walk on water because of body density, weight, mass, gravity. They give you 1,000 million reasons why scientifically it is absolutely impossible to walk on water. 1,000 million reasons. Both are civilized readings of the text. Let me say that again. Both are civilized readings of the text. When you look at this text from an Aboriginal perspective, There's something else entirely. Now, it's something the Academy does not know how to do, because the Academy has no idea how to think aboriginally, because theologians don't take shamanic journeys. But when you look at a text like this through that lens, we already have an integral worldview where, of course, turning water to wine. You learn that in tracker school in philosophy 2 or 3, I think. Walking on water's like walking on coal, hot coals, same thing. Folks, all I can tell you is I don't read the text literally, I don't read it symbolically, I don't dismiss it mythologically. I read it through a different lens of possibility. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set across the lake for Capernaum. Oh, Jesus had been there before. He'd done a lot of miracles there. It's a big town, big city. It's the big city. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. Well, of course he hadn't joined them. They got in the boat and they set off, so of course he hadn't joined them. If he'd joined them, he would have joined them down at the boat, so it's a little disjointed there. A strong wind was blowing. The waters grew rough. When they rowed 3 or 3.5 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were terrified. But he said to them, Ego eimi, it is I am. Ego eimi. Don't be afraid. Then they were willing to take him into the boat. You gotta love this. He comes up to the boat. They're not letting him in, man. Who do they have their swords? Do they have the swords out of there? Are they like, you ready to go to battle? It's a ghost, man. This is it, peep. Come on, Andrew, Peter, get those swords out, Too bad nobody knew about gunpowder. It's only after he says, Ego eimi, it's me. Don't be afraid. It's just like they're going, dude, this is like a whacked out miracle kind of thing. Okay, let him in the boat. Let him in the boat. And immediately the boats reach shore. Boom, they're there at the shore, which, indicates that Jesus just kind of walked further on about 20, 30 feet by himself. They would have all gotten there together. So it's a funny bit of irony in the narrative. The next day, the crowd that had stayed on the opposite shore of the lake realized that only one boat had been there, and that Jesus had not entered it with his disciples. They figured this out pretty quick, because Jesus lingered behind. One of the guys went down to the boat, boom, 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 and then he's hanging with the crowd, and then the boat starts there rowing away, boom, boom, boom. The storm's coming up, so the people have to scatter, and they know Jesus did not get on that boat. That's what they know. The next day, the crowd that stayed on the opposite shore of the lake realized only one boat had been there, and Jesus had not entered it with his disciples, but that they had gone away alone. Then some boats from Tiberias landed near the place where the people had eaten the bread after the Lord had given thanks, and once the crowd realized neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they got into the boats and headed to Capernaum, search of Jesus. Here's this mass crowd now, man. It's trolling Jesus. Gotta find him. And when they found him on the other side of the lake, they asked him, Rabbi, when did you get here? Now, this is a Johannine question that is loaded with irony, my friends. When did Jesus get here? In the narrative. Well, he'd gotten there in the narrative at a certain time of day previously. But when did he get here? When hologos egenetos sarx, when the word became flesh. That's when he got here. It's the answer to the question. One of the answers. And then Jesus will say, I tell you the truth, you are looking for me not because you saw samia, signs, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill. You love the whole social welfare agency thing I did for you. That's what you're really after. You just want somebody to sit and just take care of you so you can just do your thing. And I'm going to leave that thought with you here today. I want you to think about those folks that are A, politicizing Jesus, which is what got him into trouble in the text, or B, thinking like the crowds, that Jesus is all about social welfare. You have to think about this. This is very, very hard because we are so accustomed, those of us who have left the evangelical tradition and have participated in the more liberal progressive traditions, we are so accustomed to believing that our views of social justice are Jesus's views, and they're not. Okay? They're not. Sometimes they touch as a tangent, but they're not the same. In order for us to have Jesus' values, we have to learn to see things from Jesus' perspective. And in order to do that, we have to recognize that we're seeing wrongly. We're seeing like the interlocutors, the religious authorities. We're seeing like the crowds. We're seeing like the disciples. Only when we acknowledge that are we going to be able to come then and recognize who we are fundamentally as people, as a species, as persons, as individuals, and what we do. And with that, I'll hold off because next comes the incredible Bread of Life discourse. Let me wish you well today. Peace and love. That is the feeding of the 5,000 narrative. Peace.